Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us for the online NARM Basics training to become a NARM-informed professional. This is the Level 1 training in the neuroaffective relational model for helping professionals work with complex trauma. This professional training is designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. This training is for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. In this online training, participants will learn more about the changing field of trauma, a deeper understanding of the impacts of ACEs and complex trauma, and how NARM, one of the first models specifically designed to address complex trauma, can support professionals in the growing trauma-informed field. The next online NARM Basics training is starting in September 2022 and will run 1 weekend a month through December 2022. 60 continuing education units will be available for most helping professionals. Register now to reserve your spot. We hope you will join us in learning how to transform trauma. For more information and to apply to the online NARM Basics training, please visit narmtraining.com/online basics. And now for our interview. Kimberley Mead is a psychotherapist in Austin, Texas, working with individuals and couples striving to emerge from trauma and grief. Her practice facilitates healing and exploration through somatic and relational approaches, including NARM, somatic experiencing, EMDR, and interpersonal neurobiology. In this interview, Kimberley shares how her own personal experience led her to this field and how it has informed her work. Please enjoy this conversation with Kimberley Mead. I'm sitting here with Kimberley Mead. We are so happy to have you. Welcome to the podcast, Kimberley.
I'm really happy to be here.
It's lovely to meet you and have this conversation. And as you might know, we typically start these conversations with the question, what would you like for our listeners to get from our conversation today?
I think I'd really like our listeners to become more familiar with the complexities of adoption as it manifests in the life of the adopted person. So often we tell stories about the fairy tale of what adoption looks like from the outside. We're in service to the parents who are working with young children. But what I've come to learn in both my professional experience as well as my personal experience is that it can be and often is an event that continues to affect us throughout our life. Those children become adults and we forget that the adults still have some wounds and patterns that they're pulling forward. And I'd really like people to start being curious about what the experience is like from the person who has the biggest impact, because it's from possibly the day of their birth or a little bit later. And it continues to affect us and manifest.
Yes, thank you for that reminder. It continues. Okay. So tell us about the work that you do. You're a therapist, but tell us how you work in this field.
So I originally came into this field from working in the business world as a creative designer, and I changed careers in my late 30s. To me, my world has always been about gathering stories from other people and really sitting with them and trying to understand their world as it manifests. When I originally went back to school, it was entirely with the focus of working with adults of adoption. And unfortunately, I had people around me who didn't quite understand what I was saying. And they said that you can't possibly make a practice. They don't come for that reason. And so I put it to the side, put it on the bookshelf, knowing that that was kind of my secret. I was still doing it. And I started training in grief and trauma, which of course is so much of what adoption holds, the wounds of adoption can hold. And my practice here is very much about individuals who have had impermanent beginnings. So they might have had multiple families. They have difficult starts. The individuals who often stay with me the longest are individuals who have had a lot of violence in that impermanence and in that start. They've had oftentimes a loss of a parental figure, a loss of a family. And I think what can contribute to why they stay with me so long is those individuals also have physical and emotional trauma. The interesting thing about complex trauma, as I see it, when it manifests inside of an adoption world, is we have what many of us would go, oh, of course, that is trauma. You had something violent happen. You had something massive happen. And we see it and we understand it as trauma. Inside of adoption, there's also this subtlety, this covertness that our families from adoption forward can be relatively very healthy as well as potentially unhealthy, but relatively healthy. And people won't understand that there is still a wound.
Mm-hmm.
So I work with individuals who have that impermanence and have that start-stop early, who have some chaos happening in their life. Something's really blocking them. There's a lot of rigidity, a lot of confusion when they try to really identify themselves as opposed to the stories that they know about themselves.
Yeah. Wow. I'm hearing a couple things that really landed for me just as you were talking. I'm thinking first about how interesting, isn't it, that the world can tell us you can't build a whole practice on this one group of people, as if there's one or two people in the world that struggle with this and you can't build a practice. It's like everywhere. There's folks who are dealing with the effects of complex trauma and things from childhood, and in this case, adoption. And I'm just interested in how that shapes the support that's available. And I love that you didn't listen to the message.
I sort of accidentally started to listen, but I was always like, trauma,
Yeah.
body focused, because so much of the experience is before narrative memory. Although, and I'd have to look up the exact numbers, the current numbers, I think it's something like more than 40% of adoption actually occurs after the age of 2.
Mm,
So we're not talking only babies. Like there's a lot of stories about adoption.
sure.
And one of the things that I actually have seen really change as we start talking about complex trauma, developmental trauma, is I've also seen an opening up of being able to sit with the complexities of adoption. Even in the community here in Austin, we are very fortunate to have an organization that focuses adoption knowledge affiliates. More and more, I see my peers asking, hey, this person is adopted. Who works with that? I see more clients coming forward asking, I am adopted and I want to work with somebody who has that competency.
Yeah.
I see people asking me for consultation. Like if we could just get it on the radar. Adoption isn't a villain, but it's also not a fairy tale. It amplifies our childhood environment, our childhood wounds. It is inherently going to have a wound in order to get us to this event of adoption. And that's really hard to say. No person who puts a child into adoption, no adoptive parent wants to sit with the idea that this child already comes with some type of pain. And when they do embrace it, I think it has a better outcome for the child. It makes more sense in their overall story. The other thing I've noticed is that adoption is different from generation to generation. So adoptions that might have occurred when I read about them in the 30s and 40s is very different than in the 70s. It's very different than in the 80s because we have cultural influences. We have international versus domestic. We have whether or not we think of it as a secret to not be spoken about as opposed to something that we can share. And even the resources that the internet provides to help lessen the isolation that maybe historically a person who was adopted might have had. So generationally, we also have to keep up with which person is sitting in front of us.
Right.
Their reality may be different than what we even read about because it's a constantly changing environment. I was on a chat board recently and somebody asked this question, like, do all adoptees feel, fill in the blank? And half of them said, I absolutely, that's exactly it. The other half said, absolutely not. And if I hadn't had the framework of NARM, I would have been left in this chaos of, I guess adoption isn't the issue. Why is this coming up this way? But the foundation of working through attachment in the structure and the coherence that is provided by NARM, I think you touched into the very fact that adoption is messy.
Yeah.
It's chaotic. It's confusing.
I've heard so many different perspectives. And of course, individuals are going to have different perspectives. But then I'm thinking from a clinician standpoint, exactly what you named of there's going to be such a variety. And we really being open to whatever the client in front of us is bringing, how valuable that is, just that perspective of holding space for all of it. It does feel messy.
Yes. And that's the part that I think NARM really emphasized. Because I have my own adoption story. I have my own research. I was surrounded by adoptees.
Mm.
So it was always a topic. I have other individuals who are adopted in my family. So it's not unfamiliar territory.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, you can't go by even a few stories because no adoption story is the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for naming that and just helping me like organize for myself. Like, what is it that's coming up for me? Why do I feel so confused as I'm like trying to think about how do I ask these questions or how am I holding this? It makes sense that part of that is because no adoption story is the same.
Yeah. We say this with grief too. Like, even in a family, everybody experiences differently. We say it with parenting. You could have twins, but they experience slightly differently, even though they're the same age
Mm-hmm.
and they have the same parents. Who my parent is, when I have an older brother, he's 12, he got different parents than I did.
Yeah.
So that element inside of adoption of there are so many voices about adoption, my particular passion happens to be to make space and tend to the voice of the adopted individual, knowing that there are all these other voices, the constellation. Sometimes they call it the triad, but it really is a constellation of voices. And I think adding, that competency to say, like, there is a unique voice from the parent to the adult child. There's so many voices, but it's like listening to one voice inside of a chorus, which is the voice you're going to tend to.
One voice inside of a chorus. Wow.
And for me, it's the most impacted and also oftentimes the one that gets set to the side because that's inherent oftentimes with adoption. There's a story about it and we conform to it because we learned early on what would naturally unfold for someone, which is people come and go. There is an impermanence. There are choices that are made. But whatever started this event absolutely gave us a visceral knowledge that the world is not permanent. Again, too much, too soon, too fast.
Mm-hmm.
At an age when that lesson is really, really hard because we're only going to comprehend it viscerally.
Right. I'm just thinking about like, yes, there's many infant adoptions, but sometimes it's after that and like how those different points in their life, like the trajectory that it sends them on. So as a clinician, like understanding that there's going to be a lot of variation there too feels really important.
I gave a short lecture yesterday and somebody asked that, what is the difference between what happens to an individual who's adopted at birth within a day or two and a person who maybe has a later life adoption.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of took this big breath like, wow, it's like if you have the car accident when you're 3, is that different than when you're 7? Yes and no.
Yes and no.
The injury is still there. How you get tended to, your formation of what the world does or doesn't offer you is different, though, according to how early that structure is and then why that structure came about, the intergenerational trauma that might be there already delivered to you.
Yeah.
So you can see one of the reasons it's so chaotic is you have so many elements to track with an individual.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking about, the different elements and how you track that as a clinician. You mentioned a little bit about your own story. I imagine that's part of what brought you a little bit to this work, but also I'm thinking, well, but you had a whole career prior to coming to this work. So I'm curious, like what brought you back around? Were you always interested in working with complex trauma and in this field, working with adoptees? And
one way or another, the adoption story had always been something that I was an advocate about.
Yeah.
And throughout my life, both for its positives and for the hits that I took because of it, it lined me up for a lot of difficulty with my own personal relationships, being overly loyal, having difficulty to attach, but then once I attached, being overly attached to a person, any transitions, heartache, moving, fear of death regarding the parents that I had. Everything was as if you had just turned up the volume a little bit for me. And one thing that can appear for adopted individuals, and we hear it with other individuals too, is the sense of I'm too much. And so that for me is what always, because I had these unexplainable intense reactions, they were bigger than a majority of my peers. Many of my peers couldn't stay around me because they didn't understand what was going on. So I did a lot of therapy myself. So adoption had always been part of my story. I was a creative individual. I was an artist. It was encouraged in my family. But I came to a point in my career where I had to make a shift. And I just sat down and said, what is the through line? What is this other thread? Creativity is a thread. But what is the other threads that maybe I'd like to do a career around? And I chose to go back to counseling And a dear friend of mine who had known me for a while was like, I'm surprised it took you so long. That's what you said you wanted to do 8 years ago. And I'm like, I did? And they're like, yeah, but you got this great job and you went back into the creative field. I was always clear I wanted to work with trauma. I don't know that I had the words to say trauma, relational trauma. When I put those two together, relational trauma, it made so much more sense what I was working from, that it was this deeper, longer relationships with others, relationships with ourselves, that was so confusing and chaotic. And so once I put those two words together, relational trauma, it made sense what my practice looked like.
I love that. Yeah, it was very similar for me when I heard that phrase, relational trauma. It landed and I thought, oh, because I've never been to war. I've never experienced a lot of what we think of as trauma in the beginning. But then when you put those two together, it just makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm curious, I know a little bit of your background, but how did you come to NARM and what was that journey like? What led you to get trained?
So I was originally studying somatic experiencing, and I was way into somatic experiencing. I had met somebody even before I started school who was in the somatic experiencing training, and very vibrant individual. We hit it off immediately, and she kind of became my mentor. And then when I was in school, I also continued my own therapies, as we should. And I was doing somatic experiencing, and I was finding a lot of release from the trauma energy. For me, what was missing was an element of attachment. One of our SA practitioners here brought Brad in to do this introduction to this new thing called NARM. Like attachment theory, it always felt like labels to me, like just reading about attachment. But when I sat down with that training with Brad, all of a sudden it became alive to me. The term strategy changed everything for me. It changed my sense of what am I with? How can people heal? This isn't a label. This is something that's enacting. And so NARM very quickly added a level of energy and aliveness, and at the same time, ease inside of me. I've had clients who worked with me early on and then have come back, and they said, there is a difference. We feel it in the room. And I really think that's because of the work. My next phase for my particular kind of work was this edition of NARM. It kind of blended everything that I'd studied in. I'd studied IPNB. I had taken Gottman because I originally worked with couples, and I occasionally do, but they just don't show up in my practice as often. I had taken a training on internal working models, a trainings on attachment, somatic experiencing, EMDR. So you can hear the trauma that I'm really trying to understand how it sits in us from a body up perspective. And NARM just clicked everything together. And so I continued when it became available here in Austin. I was so excited and just clamored to be part of our first cohort, and really, really bonded also with so many of the people in our training. And so it very much feels like a landing, a coming to a home of like-minded people who have diverse experiences, but also it's just we're speaking the same language. It really feels like belonging to me.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate that so much, because I think that feeling that community and feeling the connection and kind of this languaging that we're able to have in the training and how experiential it is. And there's not just these concepts that we're working with in our heads, that we really can embody it and experience it inside of ourselves. So yeah, I appreciate that you named that.
It's very connected and embodied. And I mean, not to put any shade on any other approach, but for me, this kind of just knit everything together. And again, like we say in NARM, it landed with me, and I felt more free and more relaxed and more alive. I had more structure. I could, sit with clients and not feel that, what am I doing? I'm lost. And I could just resettle each time. And I found that incredibly valuable for me, and thereby the clients that I'm with that so much need agency, they need coherence, they need their therapist to be able to offer that as well. First, before, we're offering co-regulation And they start to do it for themselves, but they can't do that without us first having kind of settled as well.
Yeah. And I heard too in what you were saying that we can have all these other trainings and have all these different pieces. But one nice thing about NARM is that it helps us actually pull all those pieces together and kind of integrate. I've heard from several practitioners that feel like I had these other trainings and I wasn't really sure how to use them. But then I got the NARM training and I was able to kind of pull things in together. And so I love that. I really appreciate that it kind of honors all of the things that we've learned in other ways, and we're able to kind of integrate and pull things together. It's really great.
Really valuable.
Yeah. Well, I wondered if you would share with us, if you have any stories. I don't know if there's any clients that you've worked with that you could tell us maybe some struggle or stories of, inspiration that you have gained from learning from your clients.
When I think about my clients and the shift when I went to NARM, many of my clients had gotten used to me being a certain way. And so this was a shift for them. And being able to ask them what they most wanted for themselves, when you think from an attachment perspective, particularly for an adopted individual. So when you look at the elements of NARM, connection, we come into the world very early, we get a disconnection. We don't belong anywhere. And that shows up a lot, oftentimes throughout an adoptee's life, feeling like an other, feeling like there's a separation between us and them. We have attunement. We may be struggling, but our parent is really happy. Our adoptive family is really happy to have us. And we're like, it doesn't match our experience. So we learn very quickly to attune to our environment to find our safety. We learn inside of autonomy, and this is a big one for me inside of the adoption story, we want to fit in. We learned that our story is difficult. It's not as important possibly as the story of belonging. And one of the ways to do that is the story of our adoptive family. What do they need? And there's a struggle there of how much can I be myself? And then, of course, trust. I mean, can I trust you to help me? Can I trust you to be there for me? I've already learned something. So when I brought this into my clients and I would ask them, what do you want for yourself? Their survival strategy would absolutely pop up. I had changed. I was asking them to be more in the room.
Oh my gosh.
The coherency and congruence with me was suddenly challenged. And a few of these clients in particular, this question always brings out our attachment style. And some of my clients in particular, they were so enraged. And what I would finally get, me just holding the course, would be that they would tell me, I don't want to work that way. And my head said, you just told me what you wanted.
Oh.
And a couple of them came very close to terminating. And I would pull back the veil and say, like, this question is challenging. We are asking, something new of you, which is something that they hadn't experienced before or had been a trap before, which was for them to really connect to what they most wanted, their own identity, their story, to be vulnerable and say what they wanted and not have it denied, have their voice amplified rather than left alone or othered. And when I think of a couple of the individuals that I was working with, that kind of initial rage that this had shifted, when they finally pushed themselves to say, what do I want? You aren't being what I want. And they resettled and they stuck with it. And they went from, I don't know, or you should know, or whatever their answer was, this push-pull. And they actually had the opportunity to settle. They started really showing me where their actual strategy was and what the healing was. And so they had the ability to claim their agency inside of therapy. I've had a client, more than one, share that the consent of where are we going to go. This isn't about me knowing about adoption. And this is about me being present with their story as it manifests for them. I don't place any assumptions on them about if this is a wound or not. I listen, I'm available. I talk about it like I'm the bumpers on the lane in a bowling alley. I keep you out of the gutter, Paul, so you don't go too far off. That's the chaos. That's the going back to your strategy. And I help you really find yourself again, which is underneath all of these wounds. That person is still there. And so that to me has been sometimes a struggle, but that grounding force of, I know that this leading question, I know that my presence gives them the opportunity to really understand and unfold the story that they really are trying to get closer to themselves, and at the same time understand the wound that might be at a very, very early age. And so the two are really tightly linked.
Wow. Gosh, again, I'm like kind of having this experience where my brain is a little bit like fuzzy and I'm not quite sure what's going on up here. One thing that kind of popped out at me as you were talking was this kind of understanding that you have your own experience and what you're bringing to the room isn't so much that I'm an expert. I was adopted, so I know how this goes. And that's not what you bring. What you bring really feels like it's the understanding that everyone's story is so different. Because I imagine there's a lot of folks out there that would probably be drawn to a clinician who understands the experience for themselves. But what I'm really hearing from you is that you're able to show up in the room and allow them to have their agency.
I think of it like as being in a library. They're all books.
Mm.
Yes, I'm in the autobiography section, but each story has this richness.
Mm.
And adults of adoption oftentimes will seek out an adopted person as their therapist. And one of the reasons is exactly that they want somebody who they can say, is this normal? Does this happen to you? Especially if they haven't had other adopted persons in their world to talk about. They do see themselves as other and they're looking for belonging. That's the first kind of little clue for me. And in addition to that, I've really come to learn that when you have the ear for adoption, we hear these very subtle microaggressions, and they're so hard to track, and they're subtle. And so what I bring is the ability to hear my client and to just ask. And I often ask clients, like, we will bring in the question, we're still hypothesizing some of this is related to adoption, but adoption isn't a villain. It's not everything about us. It's one element, one deep, thread inside of this big tapestry. So what I do is I'm able to hear, to ask in the right moment. That seems like it might be related to these early experiences.
Now I'm really curious about the microaggressions. I just don't even know. What would that look like?
So one that's more obvious is when a well-meaning person says, well, they always treated you like you were their daughter. A biological person never had the chance to not be. They just were. I could push them out of the family and say, I disown you. But my mother only once accidentally said that. It was very late when I heard it for what it was. I knew what she was trying to convey, which was true love and that there was no difference for them.
Yeah.
And yet it touches a place. Another one is on TV, we hear a lot of stories about adoption. And I was watching a sitcom and the next door neighbor kid made some, sassy comment to the adult who was the lead. And the adult looks at the kid and says, well, you're adopted. And the kid just goes white, blank-faced, starts to cry and runs back in the house. And it shows out that adoption oftentimes is this duality of it's such a quote unquote beautiful thing to do, and it's also such a terrible thing to be done. We have stories about how important our DNA is. We have whole TV shows about how important it is. But with the adopted individual, sometimes we can say, well, why is that so important to you? You have this beautiful family. My parents were very loving individuals. They were flawed, like all parents.
Sure.
They had their difficulties. They had their intergenerational trauma. They didn't understand the grief. When I told them what I wanted to go back to school for, they were like, well, adoption doesn't have any problems. Why would you ever do that? So you can hear the back and forth. It can become as extreme as I've known adoptive parents who have had strangers come up to them and make comments about their children. And this is one with close friends who have adopted and their child is not visually, there is a difference between them. And they have strangers come up and make comments about it. They'll say things like, oh, I could never do that. I could never raise somebody else's child. And as we know, kids hear and pick up on these things, whether or not it's said to them. And so there's such a conflict in the American system of adoption. There's such a conflict and we sense it.
Yeah.
And it makes it even more confusing for us to raise our voices and say what we need. It makes it even more confusing for us to find our own identity inside of a culture that oftentimes doesn't know what to make of it. We don't learn about it in human growth and development because it really doesn't fit in. It's a footnote. It's one paragraph. It's only put under trauma. And yet there's such a varied experience of how much of a wound it is so varied. So the microaggressions come out in culture, they come out how other people speak, they come out in the stories about adoption. They're often fairy tale like, and they lived happily ever after. We have Harry Potter is an orphan. We have maltreatment as well as making him particularly special. So we have numerous stories about what our experience is, and so few stories that are told from the person who knows the experience. If you look at like how many adoption books are out there really aren't that many about what the experience is. There's Coming Home to Self and a couple others that are about the adult experience. Most of them are about how to parent. So they're servicing the needs of the parent and the family, and the individual can get lost in that. It doesn't mean that it does. I'm always really careful about this. There's no one way that this happens, but the individual can get lost inside of this. And that's what I love about NARM is so much about accepting this 50-50 relationship, what our environment offers, and not using blame, and how we connect to ourselves, how we connect to others as a healing place. The balance of the top-down, bottom-up approach. All of it just seems really built for working with complex trauma, developmental trauma, and adoption falls inside of those two.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm just realizing what's coming up for me is really just this awareness that I think I have a lot of fear of, like, knowing how to talk about this. And because I do know folks who have been touched by it, like, I imagine that there's a lot of us that would love to read a book by someone who has been adopted. So there's space out there, folks, if anyone wants to write the book. But I'm just thinking about even to the messages that you were given. You can't build a practice on this. There's not enough people. And what I'm really hearing is there's so much space for voices. And there's so many of us I know that want to learn more.
And there's a lot of caution from the individual who's adopted as well. You might even hear it in my voice. There's a lot of caution at times because it's a very vulnerable topic. It's a very sensitive topic. We have people who very much are adopted and they do not have these scars. They can't connect to the fact that others do. And their world is rich and alive. And we have others who have been impacted in such harsh, intense ways that their life, because of this unfolding event, remains difficult. And of course, it's not this single word, you were adopted. I was in a workshop with Robin Goebel and it was all about adoption. It was a year-long masterclass. And one of the things she asked, we had 3 adopted individuals in it, and she asked us if she could ask us a question, for everyone to listen to. And she said, are you adopted or were you adopted? And that's always stuck with me as one of my first questions for someone so that they can tell me. Because you're right, I know my story, I know many stories, I know theories, and to raise the voice of the person who has the trauma and give them structure, give them a container for it, give them a way to sort through it. So you're not leaving them just hanging and again telling their story. You're giving them the ability to integrate it, to embody the here and now, to turn it into a library of experience rather than the identity of experience, and to let them define themselves more clearly. And that's why I think the trepidation can be there, both to talk about it from the outside, but also to talk about it from the inside.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Thank you for sharing that. And I wondered if there was anything else from your own personal experience that you'd be willing to share with us, and maybe even personally too, how NARM has impacted you in the work that you're doing.
NARM has made sense to me why, for my personal nervous system, it gives me a little foothold of where I get these kind of like chaotic, shaky moments. So when I have my, attachment wound hit and kind of brushed up against, NARM has let me really kind of be able to see myself, be able to parent this younger version of myself, to understand where my emotional frustrations come from when I lose my words. And it also actually has made me really appreciate how my husband, who's known me for 24 years, but we've been married only 2 years, how his stability has really allowed me to work through this caught energy. When I sit with a NARM practitioner, I just feel like things come into focus.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it. Things come into focus. I can see that. Yeah, that lands for me. Thank you. Well, this has been really lovely. Thank you so much for taking the time today to talk with us and share what you've learned and what you continue to learn. I wonder if there's anything else that you'd like for listeners to know about the work that you're doing or anything that feels important that's left unsaid.
I think sometimes it feels like drinking from a fire hydrant. Even when I speak to people, there's, again, in my head, it's still this little story that says, this is too much, it's too fast.
No, it's great.
And there is that fuzziness that comes over at times. And I think that just means, slow down, reorganize, let your brain make those new connections. That fuzziness to me is like, oh, you reach the edges of the new connections. But being able to share some of this in the hopes that it kind of lets people understand that this is an unfolding understanding of identity it's just my passion to make sure that people have this opportunity from the outside to really learn and from the inside to really be able to connect. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of this fire hydrant that is a very complex, chaotic at times story of what adoption does to us. There's so much to learn about it. I think I could spend a lifetime just researching and sitting with stories and still have so much more to learn. And NARM at least keeps me from feeling lost inside of it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's our pleasure to have you. And I wondered if there was a place that folks can find you if they're interested in the work that you're doing and where your practice is.
So I'm in Austin, Texas. I am also a supervisor,
Great.
so I have 6 associates who work with me.
Great.
And they hear my soapboxes, I'm sure, sometimes of topics I particularly love. And I do have a website. It's kmeadcounseling.com. My adopted mom threw an extra letter into my name, Kimberley. There's an EY, and it causes so much difficulty. So I just went with K Mead, but that little E is so precious to me. It was a beautiful gift that she gave me of belonging to my new family, and I treasure it, even though it causes a lot. So it's K Mead Counseling. I talk a little bit about adoption there, and I'm hoping to do more speaking engagements as I get more comfortable with this format and being able to know, yes, I can present a fire hydrant without everybody drowning in the room.
Well, I didn't drown. I survived, but I probably came to it with my own hangups and like wanting to badly to learn and understand. And so maybe I was pressuring myself a little bit. But this has been really lovely, and I really appreciate you sharing and your heartfulness.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Hey, Transforming Trauma listeners. Please join us starting in September for our online NARM Basics training to learn how to transform trauma. This training is available for helping professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Now more than ever before, it is essential that we learn how to resolve complex trauma and support post-traumatic growth. If you are looking for more advanced training in understanding the impacts of attachment, relational, developmental, and intergenerational trauma, and are working in healthcare, education, substance abuse recovery, or allied fields, join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/online basics. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.